something here.
Well, thanks for coming on this lovely afternoon. We're gonna have just a jam-packed schedule for the next hour. Lunch, of course, will follow. But first, per our tradition at the end, toward the end anyway of the term, we have a new senior research fellow to induct today to the Ostrom Workshop, which we're just thrilled about. And past honorees include several who we have in attendance right now, including Barb, one of our colloquium speakers for today, and Dan, of course, and Bernie and Jimmy, and many others who have contributed. And of course, Michael needs come on. You should get an asterisk plus, even just for the teacher training alone on Friday. My goodness, here for your help. That was.
Value that.
Yeah, exactly. So in other words, he's joining August company today. For those who might not be familiar, senior research fellows are workshop affiliates who have really gone above and beyond with their contributions over an extended period of time, including as former directors, scholarship service on the WAC, etc. You meet almost every single one of those and then some, basically. So thank you for allowing us to honor you in this way today. For those who might not be familiar, Paul is a KPMG professor of governance at the University of Bucharest. A senior research fellow in the F.A. Hayek program for advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics, the PPE program at Mercatus, at George Mason, where he teaches in the graduate program of the economics department, and an affiliated researcher with the Ed Snyder Center at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, College Park. So, Paul, we don't have to put you on the spot with any remarks, but we're just thrilled to be able to honor you in this way. And thank you so much for your service and all of your contributions to the workshop over so many years.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to by this incredible decision, and I've been part of this community for a long while, and I'm planning to continue to be part of it. And I'm looking forward to the next steps and the next stages in the evolution of both the research community that we are part of and the research program that we'd like to advance to new dimensions. So thank you so much. Looking forward to working with you in the future.
Absolutely, Paul. Likewise. And we have a super fancy certificate for you that you will be getting as well to add to your collection. So thank you again, Paul. We're thrilled. And of course, please feel free to hang out while we continue on with our colloquium speaker for today.
Absolutely.
But before I forget, it is a jam-packed couple weeks at the workshop. Today, there's a Beyond the Web happening at 2:00. And we have our Hootenanny. Don't forget about the Hootenanny at 5:00. If you haven't experienced a workshop Hootenanny, then you have not lived. So be here or be square. And there'll be a little happy hour after that for those who are available and so inclined. And of course, Stephanie Research Series, Wednesday, Urban Forested Patches and CPRs. That's going to be great. Just a sampling of the many things happening. Today, though, we get to focus on you both, Barb and Lindsay. I don't need no introduction to this community, but we'll do a quick one. Okay, so bear with me. So Barb Allen is the James Woodward Strong Professor of the Liberal Arts at Carleton College at Northfield, Minnesota. She's political science and filmmaker. Her documentary, which I love, Actual World, Possible Future, explores, of course, Lynn's work on environmental dilemmas and won the 2020 Telly Award, which is so cool. Her research in political communication includes analyzing election news coverage and political advertising, and has written a number of incredible books, including Truth in Advertising, Lies in Political Advertising, and How They Affect the Electorate. So thank you, Barb, for being back at the workshop. And of course, we also have Lindsay with us. Lindsay Flynn is an associate professor of political science and the deputy director of the Master in European Governance at the University of Luxembourg. She is also the PI of the FNR funded Propel project, Proactive Policymaking for Equity Lives, which examines the links between governmental policy, housing markets, and inequality by examining the challenges current generations face in high-income OECD countries. And that's a really cool mixed methods project. So really, really cool stuff. And today they're focusing on their work, ideas, and institutions, the epistemology of the institutional analysis and development framework with a focus on language and framing policy analysis. We did it. So Barb, Lindsay, I'll happily help keep the cue when we get to that point. And the floor is yours. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure, and it's a pleasure for me to be able to bring my colleague from the University of Luxembourg, Lindsay Flynn, to the workshop. Lindsay does have some spectacular work in multiple countries. So it is the many countries of the EU, Norway and Switzerland and the United States. So yes, so there are many questions that should be directed to Lindsay. Let me tell you what we had in mind with this paper. And we hope we'll be speaking for maybe 15 or 20 minutes and then really get to some serious conversations in the tradition of the colloquium. So we had in mind, because it's the 50th anniversary, I really wanted to go back a bit to look at the evolution of the IAD framework, which, and I'll be thinking, I may say IAD or we may say IAD, but we mean IAD/SES. Because we see the SES, I believe, as an elaboration of the institutional analysis and development framework in fleshing out the links between the physical world, the biophysical world, and the social world. Going back and thinking about the IAD framework, then I want to make the case for you that we have an emphasis in the very early work on the IAD on information and then specifically language. And I think as Paul and his often co-author Peter Betke have helped us understand, there is an even deeper social theory that should be being utilized much more in everyday research in public policy. One little angle on that social theory has to do with language and has to do with the problems of language. And since, as you heard, a lot of what I'm thinking about is misinformation and lies. Language and lying, and using language to frame and using language to not only frame but lie is a very important thing. And I would make the argument should be much more prominent in thinking about institutional analysis. We wanted then to apply some of this thinking to a particular area, which would be housing, and some of the frames around housing policy, and some thoughts that we have so far about how those frames might work and where that we might find those frames. So to be then very brief, in 1973, when the year that we're all celebrating, I met Lynn and Vincent, and they had a thing called the model of man that they were working on, MOM. Because the first thing I said to Lynn when she handed me this paper to read was, man, about humanity.
Yeah,
and after all,
exactly.
it was 1973, not 1953. So she said, well, we've got gender in there. It's mom. What that paper was all about. Help. What that paper was all about was a picture of their, as Peter and Paul have talked about, their deep, or they've used the word profound, social philosophy, that you have to start with a model of the human being, and it has to be a realistic model. If you fast forward this a bit into the founding of the Public Choice Society, I think for many people in the room, you would be thinking about what are the main attributes of rational choice. And among those would be something like self-interest and also ability to rank preferences and or utility functions or things like this. Now, while they have publications that say those things, in fact, that was never really the deep social theory. As if you read the paper, as you'll see, much more prominent in terms of their idea of who the human being was a curious, forward-looking, of course, interested in self-preservation, but aware that there are some things worse than death in terms of self-preservation. So here we have reputation. We have already the idea of iterations of activity and the necessity for trust and so forth. So all of these were embedded in the deep social theory already by the late 1970s at the very least. And by 1982, when Larry Kaiser and Lynn Ostrom wrote the IAD, if you go back to that paper, the very first paragraph is about the problem of language. Now, for Lynn, the problem of language specifically, and in this paper, was that language was across disciplines almost unable to communicate ideas from one place to another about a variety of public policy issues. So theory versus theory versus theory was going to be unclear. And what she and Larry Kaiser wanted to do was have what they called a meta-theoretical analysis, and that's what the IAD framework became. They cite Vincent in that very first paragraph. In the very same year, he was writing about the problem of language from a somewhat different angle. For him, the problem of language goes back to human fallibility and our really difficult time with articulating our experiences to each other, and the fact that language can be so easily manipulated. Of course, that's a thread that follows through well into the 90s for him and into his 90s as well, in thinking about things like the glittering generalities that are put forward in terms of public policy. So we will maybe get to some slides at a later point, but I just wanted to talk it through with you at first. If you go back and we can look at this, I have these slides if we need to refer to them. If you look at any of these early pictures of the IAD, if you look at the SES now, you will see not only are there 3 worlds of action and all of those kinds of things, but you will see that there is in every one of these for information. And so maybe I will share the screen in a moment. Information is at first taken at face value as if people have not perfect information. So it's not that of the economists, but people have sufficient information to solve the problem. And that's where I guess I'd say my work comes in. Very often that is not true at all. And so as the framework moves along, I see more and more time dedicated to the idea that people don't have sufficient information and that there are what we might call information games. Okay, so Lindsay and I took that to the idea of framing. And I will give a couple of definitions regarding framing, and then Lindsay will speak a little bit about what we think we find right now with information framing regarding housing. Framing means putting into contexts, most simply. And many of the things that those of us who do work in this area can tell you is that it is not the case that you can have just any frame and have anyone come up with a frame. It depends on what we think about the author of this policy. What do we think about what is their credibility there? So all of those kinds of things, of course, come into play. But in general, what we're thinking about are ways in which we have multiple considerations brought to bear in making a decision, and the frame is to elevate some considerations above others. Okay, so that's basically what we're thinking about with this. So if I want someone to make a decision about whether to have a public protest or not, if I want them to say yes, then maybe I emphasize the frame of free speech. If I want voters to say no, then maybe I emphasize the frame of public safety. So in general, that's what we mean by something like framing. And this is as distinct from the concept of persuasion. In terms of persuasion, we're actually changing the content of people's belief. In the idea of framing, what we're changing is which belief they bring to bear in making the decision. This is also related to a third concept called priming, in which I would want to engage the emotional content of a decision. I think this has also changed in terms of the rational choice approach. All rational ways of looking at things have a memory component. People think about what's happened in the past. This is also in Vincent's work where you think about learning and you think about the ways that people look at consequences of actions and move forward and make different decisions. Attached to those memories are feelings, the way that I felt in that, why I want to avoid that. So rational choices also always engage affective responses, emotions. And so in the literature on priming, what we're trying to do is influence people by bringing to mind some or priming those latent emotional responses. So one of the concerns of Vincent was that what we were pretty often engaging were contesting frames, some of which were truthful and some of which were not, priming emotions that were, I mean, emotions are legitimate, that's not even a term we use for these kinds of things, but bringing to bear fear, anger, emotions that were very often not going to be leading us in a good policymaking direction. So frames can backfire. We can have strong frames and weak frames. Frames can be highly problematic, but everything is framed. So what I want to do now is begin to move us toward a discussion of framing. And I'm going to turn this over to Lindsay, and I will, as soon as I can figure out how to share the screen, I will be doing that. There we go.
I can share my screen too.
Oh, yeah.
Are you sharing yours?
Can you stop yours and then I can share mine?
Sure.
Okay. So you might be wondering why we're talking about housing after we've been talking about learning and information and priming. So one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about is why we might expect information flows and framing to be so important in the space of housing policy, which is where my research is. I basically study the politics of housing inequality. So let me give you some data on why we might expect this to be an area where framing could really occur. So what you see here is a comparison of the size of wealth stores of residential real estate compared to other stores of wealth. So for instance, globally, and this is 2020 from Saville's research, residential real estate is a more store of wealth than global equities and global debt securities combined. So it's really quite large. It's about 4 times the size of global GDP. If we move away from the size of stores and look at the size of the industries and sectors that are associated. This is again 2020, but just for the European Union. Real estate activities are 11% of gross value added, construction 5%, finance and insurance activities. It's not all housing, but a lot of it is. So for comparison, the size of these sectors is the size of all other industry except for construction in the EU. And that this is similar to worldwide. So at the end of the day, what we see here then is that you have a major economic driver. The Lehman Federal Reserve said housing is the driver of the economy, plus a lot of industries that have a lot of structural power. So we should expect that these are areas where framing and wanting to provide certain types of information to people who will be making decisions about their lives and livelihoods will come into play. Now, it's not just at the macro level that we might expect this to become particularly salient politically. So here you can see often in the past, we've talked about income inequality. And these are some of the countries that I study. And you can see that wealth inequality, this is not the only measure of inequality. It's the share held by the top 10%, but it's one measure of inequality. In most countries, wealth inequality is 2 to 3 times the size of income inequality. And the important thing here is that at the household level, where we're looking at this, housing is the primary store of wealth for most people. And even those people where housing is not the primary store of wealth, they are often investing in mechanisms and vehicles that are based in the housing market. So one other reason why frames might be really important here is to go even lower. So looking at a different part of the income distribution, the bottom quintile, and again, more or less the same countries, we see the housing overburden rate. So this is the extent to which the share of households who are spending more than 40% of their disposable income on housing. Best case scenario, Germany, it's a little under 1 in 5. To the case of the United States, we're nearing half of the share of this population. And by all estimates, this is really conservative. So we expect that if you're a low income household, it's not 40% of your income that would be an overburden. It's 10 or 20% of your income would be a housing overburden. So as you can imagine, and as you've probably been watching in places throughout Europe and the US, housing has become particularly politically salient. What you see here is a street protest from the Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen, which was, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it started in 2018, 2019, and culminated in a referendum in Berlin in fall of 2021. Where Berliners voted to expropriate about 10% of the private rental stock to bring it back to the public sector. And this would have been the stock that was from big institutional corporate landlords like Deutsche Wohnen. And so we then again see here all of these ways where we might expect framing to be used or received within housing as a policy space. So what we're doing in this paper, and this is sort of our first attempt to really begin thinking about the most salient frames and which of these frames might be strong frames or weak frames, are identifying two sets of ways to frame the issue of housing. One we're calling for now the housing market frame. The other we're calling the housing purpose frame. And we think that each of these has different ways that actors will try to leverage them and that individuals will receive these frames. So just to give you a couple of examples, you can see more in the paper. We can talk about them in the Q&A because I want to make sure that we leave some time. With the housing market frame, we can ask, what would the narrative of this frame be? Who might use it? What strategy are they using for this narrative? So the economic contribution narrative might be something like, and we see this in newspapers. I'll direct you to the bibliography for the citations here, but the housing market or housing prices are actually seen as individuals. There's lots of metaphors used that it's very healthy for house price appreciation. Contrast that with what we're calling the lived experience frame, where you may be using a frame of crisis. So not that it's a crisis formed by housing booms and busts, but instead by a chronic unaffordability crisis. And as Barbara mentioned, these can be leveraged in different ways. So you may be able to leverage these via emotions or by aligning them with recurrent ideologies. To give one more example, thinking about the housing as purpose frame, and we in the paper are describing some of this as a way that the idea of the commons could be used in the area of housing, is that we could, on the one hand, be seeing and receiving narratives around houses as a form of consumption or as a commodity, that we should all be private investors, if you're familiar with the financialization of everyday life literature, versus housing being something that meets a basic need, that leverages concepts of fairness. So in general, what we think here is that there are a lot of ways in which houses, which are viewed very differently as both a consumption good and an investment, and are always top of mind in the current political climate, can be a space where we can apply some of the social theory and the importance of information and language to a policy area in a way that it hasn't been applied too much to date. So I'll turn things back over to Barbara for the wrap up and kicking off our discussion.
Sure. So what we've tried to briefly walk you through is the idea that there's a social theory. The social theory involves language, and language can involve error and the necessity for correcting errors. It also can involve deception. All language frames policy. Thinking about the policy frames is important. And we should not think of framing as deceptive. We should think about framing as another strategic part of an IAD or SES framework. These are some of the ideas deployed by people to get across whatever it is they're trying to accomplish and to make those accomplishments. In trying to apply this then in a policy area, what we've hoped that you could see is that here is a really important policy area, and we are seeing various frames deployed. And I think it's a situation in which if you were analyzing policy, you would not want to accept a given way of looking at this, i.e. a frame, as the way to look at this. We have to be much broader in our understanding than that, and that would be true of ever so many things. And if we could as analysts think this way, I think this needs to be much bigger part of our meta-theoretical framework for understanding policy making, and especially in those situations where we as people living on the planet see ourselves as having a stake in the education of people about these different areas. So we have some questions, but really what I think our main question is, what's on your minds? And what do you think?
We'll turn to that next. Terrific. First off, thank you very much. And I'll happily help keep the queue here for those online and looking around for those in person. I know that's percolating a lot of great ideas, no doubt from you. I will just make sure there's no students who want to jump the gun first, though. No pressure. Yeah, I know it's a busy time of year, so maybe Mike, you can kick us off. Okay, and we'll take it from there.
There's like a lot of comments.
Great.
This was interesting, going back and seeing the IAD framework and sort of how it started and how information was really, really critical in there. And that somehow got lost in the process in the way that the IAD has been applied in different ways. In a book chapter that I put together in one of the volumes that Dan and I put together, and then I used in graduate seminar here a lot, I advise that one way to important rule to apply the IAD is to follow the information. Follow the money, sort of the normal sort of, follow the information. Where's the information coming into the different flows here? And that was a little hard to justify. That's not the way people tended to use it. They tend to follow the resources. The flow of resources. They tend to follow the rule of the rules. What were the rules being used in the monitoring and stuff like that? But I think the connections between different aspects. And I also think in action situations as many of them in one policy area. So I've always sort of had that network sort of view. And so I think you're onto something really important, and somehow that got lost in the IAD framework, the importance of framing as being important in that different actors are coming to an IAD, not just with different interests, but with different framings, different understandings of the problem. And a critical part of what goes on inside that interaction is not balancing interests and trying to find a reasonable source solution, but it's trying to find a frame or a combination of frames or a mixture of frames that is acceptable to enough of the actors sort of involved in it. And so I think that's a great way to sort of focus on that. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. And I think in housing policy is an interesting example for that, because I checked some of my policy textbooks. I have a sort of a pile of them come over the years. And not many of them have a chapter on housing policy. Okay, they have chapters on health policy and economic policy and urban management and all those kinds of things. But there's usually some housing involved in that. In what you've talked about, what you've identified here, is housing is really an interesting one because it has economic importance at the macro level. It has economic importance at the individual level. It has importance at the individual level in terms of providing security, some sense of undermining mental health, and so it ties into mental health kinds of issues. So it's every health and all those kinds of issues. But I think if you think of using the IAD framework in the sense of you don't start with the way most people apply the IAD framework, but start first with that contestation over the frames, that will be an interesting way to do it in an effective way. And I think it will be a very different kind of interpretation of the IAD that would be very useful. So I encourage you to follow that up a little bit. With that contestation over the framing, so there's not one right framing, that all of these are right to some extent, and in that. So I'm just curious if you have a sort of an immediate reaction to that, if that's what you have in mind.
Okay, thank you for that, Mike. Yeah, let me just push this a little bit farther in a couple of ways. So in a lot of Vincent's writings, there would be this idea of coming to shared understanding and the absolute necessity of shared understanding. And I think that most of the shared understanding needed to be, I suppose, about the norms and values of contestation. Okay, so you had to be able to share the idea that it was good to work through things. And you also had to share the understanding that all solutions are provisional and that you had to you would have the next iteration would show the problems that came with that policy. So those are the shared understandings, not the agreement necessarily about the policy. It was the bigger frame. And that always took Vincent to the constitutional choice level, that the shared understanding had to be about the idea of the conceptual unanimity of James Buchanan, so that we conceive ourselves as being in this together and needing to stay together and work things out. So I think that was a lot of what shared understanding needed to be, and it's not articulated, if I can put it, it's not articulated well or maybe at all in the IAD framework. Right. So I think that's to that that particular point. Lindsay, do you want to comment on the housing?
Yeah, just to follow up on your point, the housing is something in these public policy books, and it's true. And if it's present, then it's often only looking at social housing. And so I think that we are in a economic situation where housing financialization and global markets actually brings housing into discussion in a different way, both at the macroeconomic level, but also, I mean, as you said, at the micro level, in the ways in which different policy tools are leveraged. So we often talk about rental subsidies in a very different way, and it's a very different policy tool than a tax incentive for mortgage interest deductions. And the narratives and the discourse that we have around each of those is incredibly different and brings in concepts of deservingness. And so it does bring in all of these emotional components as well.
I would just add, if we go back to the framing of what the purpose of housing is, I mean, a very early frame is that the purpose of housing is so that people have a stake in the community and so that they are motivated to participate because they have something there. And I think that is not well recognized in a lot of the literature as a legitimate way to talk about rights and duties.
We have Dan next, and then Paul, Edu, and then Jimmy so far.
I agree with Mike. It's a great project. And I would encourage you to think about how IAD might be applied in a way that's conducive to this analysis. And I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is that, as Lynn often used to say, people enter the action situation not only with their interests, but their strategies. which would include framing things in a certain way. Then there are the information rules that are binding somehow or supposedly on the action situation, so that the information rules are going to vary depending on the forum of the action situation. So if you're in a congressional committee room, you're going to be subject to certain information rules that are going to affect the ability to frame in certain ways. If you're in a courtroom, very different set of information rules, right? So I'd encourage you to think also about the organization of decision-making within the action, within which the action situation is set.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And Paul, you are next, sir, and then Edu.
Yeah, this is a contribution or beginning of a contribution in the workshop tradition, looking at the same time at the foundational set of issues and on the applied side at the same thing, at the same time. So my comment would be on the foundational side of things, where you brought to put on the table two crucial issues in the research program, which is one of them, the problem of framing, and the other one, the problem of information. And when it comes to framing, I think that it is important to keep in mind that precisely at the same time when the workshop and Lynn was exploring issues related to collective action, we had similar parallel programs, and one of them was Pamela Oliver's program. So the difference between the workshop approach and Pamela Oliver's approach was that the workshop was using game theoretical frameworks mostly, while Pamela Oliver and her collaborators were using threshold models of collective action. But the interesting thing is that very soon in her attempt to build up a general theory of collective action, she reached pretty similar conclusions as the conclusions reached by the Ostroms and the workshop team, which is there is no general theory of collective action. Therefore, there is no one solution to the collective action. And everything that comes as a set of corollaries for that basic insight. So the entire Olsonian program was simply after 40 years of research brought to this point. But Pamela Oliver also started to write a series of papers precisely about framing and frames. So this is what I think that is implicit in the research program focused on collective action. So you have brought the research line of the Ostromian, the workshop line, to the point where, again, we see that we have sooner or later to engage the issue of framing and the entire set of problems which are coming with that. Now, as far as I know, Pamela Oliver and her team haven't done much after reaching the point where they decided that definitely it's important to introduce framing into the picture. It might be the case that that was due to the fact that they're using threshold models, as opposed to the game theoretical models, which have to be based, as you have mentioned at the very beginning, on models of human being and human decision making, while threshold models are aggregated models, mostly looking at how aggregation takes place in connection to a specific goal. So this is my first comment. So I think that you are actually making an important contribution in terms of pushing forward the research program of the workshop. I think that as opposed to other approaches to the problem of collective action, which they have discovered the problem of framing, but were unable to move it beyond that, I think that there is more room into the ways that what you have called the social philosophy of the Ostrom's approach in terms of elaborating and further extending this type of approach. And I think that basically this is a new level, a new dimension of the research program. The second point is related to that, is different, but is related to that, and this is related to information theory. And the fact that the framing, and as you have pointed out, and has already been pointed out in the conversation, that this is an excellent bridge between the two. And again, I want to go back to the foundations and the history of the Bloomington Research Program and bring back to your attention the fact that Vincent was very much influenced by cybernetics in the 50s, and especially by the work of Ashby. And basically from Ashby's work, the most important thing there was of self-governance, how it is possible to generate self-governance mechanisms. And the clue was cybernetics. But cybernetics at that point was seen mostly as a control theory, not an information theory. So later, cybernetics, because of various, including Shannon's work, was converted into mostly an information theory, but it was a control and self-control, self-governance theory. So again, with framing, with the theory of information as a connection to control theory as self-governance, again, I think that you are looking at some foundational issues, which in a sense might bring a new dimension, a fresh dimension to the exploration of the workshop. So like I said, I focused my comments on the foundational side of your paper. And I think that from the very beginning, you have put on the table two very important issues and two possible very important foundational directions, which were actually from the very beginning built into the workshop's perspective. So thanks a lot for the paper.
You. I have one response and maybe a question which potentially others would want to answer as well. The response is that I think that one of the things that Vincent did look at the Design for a Brain. That was an important book for him, Ashby's Design for a Brain. I think that potentially he moved away from some of these ideas because there was too much emphasis on spontaneity, meaning spontaneous organization, and too little emphasis on the institutional analysis and the rules. So I do see a tension there, and that's interesting. The other idea that your comment brings to mind for me, and this is a more general question, the meta-theoretical idea from Kaiser and Ostrom was to work at 3 levels of action. And I wonder what others think about the possibility of using the same meta-theoretical and the same picture to think at the constitutional level as the one that you use for the collective choice level or an operational level. But the constitutional and the collective choice levels, I want to explore more whether these are really going to work with the same picture of an action arena. So those are 2 comments.
Very helpful. Anything from you? You good? Okay, great. I know that there's a wealth of, including a lot of additional insights we want to get to. So maybe, thank you so much, Paul. Edu, we'll turn to you, and then Jimmy and Gustavo.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara and Lindsay. This is great. I'm really so glad that you're tackling this, because we often use, some analysis of framing implicitly in the IAD, right? You're trying, I think, to get to a more formal level, and I think all the elements are there. I mean, we're talking about action situations. It's about, problem definition, cause identification, moral evaluation, solution, and so forth. So framing is everywhere, but we don't do so as formally as I think we should. My question is about the challenges that you're facing on operationalizing it. And here's why, I think. Evan Dennis, who is on the call here, and I did a paper based on the very extensive work that Evan has done using framing to look at water problems in San Diego and how framing has changed over time and changed the connection between different agencies and so forth. You worked really well, I think. Evan did a fantastic job doing that analysis, but it was retrospective in most of it, looking into the evolution of documents and, sort of how it developed over time. But the challenge that I find is on at the operational level, if you will, problems that are developing, right? And then how do we bring framing to the analysis? Because the frame itself is an outcome of the interactions that you see in an action situation. So it's an evolving thing. So just sort of raising this question about what are the challenges that you're facing operationalizing it, and thank you so much. This is very provocative and really a big contribution, as Paul just said.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll kick us off. And actually, this is something that we would love feedback on as we are at these initial stages of thinking about what is likely and plausible in doing the hypothesis building and then moving to the how do we actually operationalize this, measure it, and test it. So we in many ways want to do what we know, which between us is, some content analysis, some interviews. I think that, depending on where this research agenda of ours goes, that we'd like to take the historical look, recent history, how are these narratives deployed in either popular culture at times or through newspapers, but also thinking very carefully about what are the different conditions on the ground right now in different countries, and where we actually do a little bit of field work to test out either experimentally or otherwise some of these. The expropriate Deutsche Wohnen is actually still ongoing. There are many places, for instance, in Spain, where these conversations are being had as we go along, and so I think there are opportunities there as well. Barbara, what do you think?
Yes, I think that probably a lot of things are going to be content analysis, because most of the work that I've done on political advertising and news coverage of different things has been based on content analyzing the actual news programs or the actual visuals and scripts of the political ads. In addition to thinking about the ways that media are deploying various frames, it has also crossed our minds that we might look at some specific case studies of policies going forward, and then also some retrospective discourses on policies, in which one might look at legislative records, the records of speeches and so forth. So I've done some speech analysis in terms of content analysis as well. But your point about how the frames are being deployed in the action situation, I think that if we were looking in a situation of the actual passage of bills, to get to Dan's point, we would be able to look at the rules of discourse around that. We would be able to look at the discourses in organizations, because in many places there would be lobbyists, and we'd be able to look at the discourses in media around that policy area. So that might be something. I always like the idea of somehow triangulating if you're doing this kind of content analysis, so that you're looking at multiple actors in a kind of crosstalk situation. So that's what comes to my mind, but we are really open on advice for the operationalization and empirical part.
Did you have 2 fingers on that?
Yeah, just thinking, you could do some of this with lab experiments too.
Yes.
Really interesting.
Jimmy might have some thoughts. I think you're next.
That's where I'll start.
I think Gustavo and Diego.
So I think this is really interesting. I think it's too bad it didn't come up 30 years ago or something. Maybe it did, and that's part of it. So
Yeah.
go back to experiments for a minute. I think this is interesting, that experiments in economics. Early guys, in particular Vernon Smith and Charlie Plott, started to design experiments, and they were the guys that sort of set the standard of our experiments should be vanilla. The frame should be as neutral as we can think about making it. So they were thinking along these lines of how the frame makes a difference. And sort of my initiation into the IAD here is certainly not, well, it's for almost everybody here, much less. But that's actually kind of how I thought about it, as being, it's just this very neutral thing that there were actors, but we didn't talk about who those actors were and how they might interact in those things. So, and I also thought of that the IAD is just really it's another tool, and another tool for thinking about research. So when we were talking about it, what popped in my head was not housing, but I think a topic that very much trying to understand it and see the strategies that are implied, maybe much not more important than housing, but certainly press, is abortion rights. And if you look at my work, the way I see it, if you see the 2 groups that are out there on these 2 sides, that's exactly what they're doing. They're framing these things in a way that comes at the problem or comes at their point of view in a much different way. And going to Dan's point about strategies, then there we have these marriage of these agents over here who are very different from each other. But they're taking advantage of each other. So I think it's in that sense, starting to think about how you take this framework and incorporate framing makes such a difference. So it's really powerful, I think.
That's really helpful. One of the things that there are a couple of paragraphs in understanding institutional diversity where I feel like you see Lynn's ideas on this changing a little bit. She has I recall an image from Doug North's work in which information is conceptualized as vanilla. And she actually has 2 or 3 sentences in which she's saying information can be used strategically. But that's about all there is. So, yeah.
But it's information and framing may be a type of information. I don't know.
Yes, I think it reveals, yes.
That's great. Yeah, no, please, Mike. Yeah.
I like Jimmy's explanation of these experiments were vanilla.
I can come up with- That's what they call them. But it's-
But you, Lynn and Roy let the experimental subjects talk to each other. I saw a lot of presentations around here where you guys were struggling to come up with, how did they interpret this?
Right.
How do they interpret this problem? And so, I mean, there was framing going on that you didn't have a way to sort of deal with.
Because we were trying to be
You
neutral.
tried to avoid all the framing, but the people were bringing their own frame in. And that was kind of the lesson that Lynn took from this, was that you let people talk, they find some way around it.
The idea was not to introduce that frame to
Right.
them.
Let
but
them
let
come up
them. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think we have Gustavo. Brian, we'll turn to you after Gustavo. And I think Diego.
Okay,
Let me know. We can do a lightning round if we need to. Yeah.
super interesting stuff. So 3 brief comments. So the first one is, I think it would be interesting to see more the connections between clashes of interest and framings, okay? So my starting point would be something in a situation in which the players are entering with no conflict of interest. Do we have this issue or not? So how independent is this issue from the deep structural clashes of interest? The second one, some classical ideas from, domestic and international politics. It's pretty common if you talk with people that study lobby, that essentially industries do not come and tell you, do this or give me this tariff because it will generate more profits to me. They come and says like, well, this will generate more jobs in this sector. This is related to national security. So they start to sell their selfish interest as a common goal. If you go and read international politics, that would be a common thing in diplomacy. Everybody tries to sell the selfish national interest as the best thing for the international community. So the same logic there. So I think there is room to thinking about this. And then the third point related to this, like an idea. So maybe we should be talking about two frames, okay? One is more internal, pretty close to your material or whatever its selfish interest. And that frame is used to navigate a complicated strategic interaction. And then the second one, the ones that you deploy in the public discourse to strategically push your interests, okay? So essentially everybody's entering with two frames. You can connect with, poli-science, Machiavelli things, is internal within the palace, and then the public discourse. And that's part which is interesting to explore and think about.
So thank you. There's a lot there. So I want to think about some of this, but I'll say for now on your second point about lobbying, we in fact see this when we look at this. This is not my research, but you can look at the bibliography for those who are doing it. They've analyzed where news articles from journalists, this was happening in the UK, where the news articles about housing were coming from. And they were coming from press releases from industry. And so you sort of see that there's this connection that is not, the lobbying of, oh, please give us more money, but a very strategic way of deploying frames that then are viewed not through that lens of the press release, but through the news article that doesn't necessarily even mention the press release.
Finger on
Oh,
that.
please,
There's
yeah,
some
yeah.
work by Jeff Lorenz that shows that that's also the case of legislation in the US. They essentially, the language comes directly from the lobbyists in terms of the way that it's framed in the legislation. So just might be another conduit.
At the state level. Okay, so Brian, you're up, sir. And
Good.
Diego.
Good. Neat stuff. This is for Barbara and Lindsay, but also if Paul has any comments. You talked about Vincent and the importance of contestation and people trying to seek shared understanding. Then you followed Vincent to Buchanan, and as if there has to be unanimity at the constitutional level. And my question is, what if you drop that assumption and say at the constitutional level, it may again be contestation and finding provisional forms of shared understanding. And yeah, so you, but again, if Paul wants to offer anything, because it's been one of my concerns that kind of back in my head bothered me for a long time.
It's nice to see you, Brian. Thank you. I'll start, but I think this is deep, and so I'd like to hear others on this as well. I think that Buchanan and Gordon Tullock did too. I think their point was you're either inside or outside of the community. I think that's how they conceptualize this. And so it's a sort of Hobbesian Hobbes type idea that you either have decided that you're part of the covenant and you're creating the Leviathan or whatever you create next, or you're an outlaw. So I think that's how they were thinking about conceptual unanimity, but their argument is broad like this. I think that Vincent did move this to a stage where there could be ongoing contestation at a constitutional level. Because otherwise what you were creating was a Leviathan. And I think that the question would be, what are the institutional arrangements that allow us to push constitutional choices as an ongoing thing? I think that is a critical question. What's the mental stance of people to be if we are going to have that level of contestation? Human beings have to think about things in a different way. And I think about in Tocqueville's Democracy in America, how astonished he was that in his view, people in the United States could go for 2 years without a constitution, as he saw it. So from the Articles of Confederation to the 1789 Constitution, it was a 2-year hiatus. And his perception of this was they went about daily life, and they had been doing this for now this, of course, I mean, as we know, this isn't everybody, but daily life continued and village life continued, and people had an attitude about this, which was solving the problems on the ground right now. And so there's much more to be said about that, but I think there's an issue of the mental stance that people have. And that has to do with their conception of their relationship to others and their conception of their relationship to a polity. I think it has to do with that really pretty fundamentally. But there are ways in which I think you must be able to contest at the constitutional level, or you simply recreate Leviathan.
We are pretty much out of time. I hate to say, Diego, are you okay if you go like right after, like maybe just have a chat with them? Okay, great, perfect. So any final reflections, thoughts from either of you before we have to close, unfortunately.
Just a thanks for the great brainstorming. Like I said, we're in our early stages, and so this is all incredibly helpful as we start to sort out what the next steps are.
Yes, thank you. It's just been terrific to be back, and I hope folks will come to the Hootenanny so we can.
Oh, yeah.
you know.
Be there, be square.
And I miss all of you who are on Zoom, but I see Alfonso, I see all sorts of faces that I'm just very pleased to. Brenda, don't see your face, but I see your name. It's just great to see everybody. I can't name everyone. And I'm happy for Gustavo's and Evan's work. So thank you for what you've been doing on analyzing that.
And there were some good chats and references. We're going to keep the chat for you guys, obviously, from Edu and Brenda. So, hey, one more round of applause. Thank you so much, Cara, Linda.